Thank you, Acting Deputy President. I do congratulate Senator Patrick for bringing this legislation before us today. The Greens strongly support it. It is about saving lives. And we've just heard the most extraordinary speech from the Coalition representative, Senator Hume. She set out that the government will refuse to support a bill that is absolutely essential. We've seen the tragedy that can unfold. You feel that we're on the verge of more tragedies happening in this country where people are burnt to death because of the state of the building industry. So we've heard the government set out so clearly that they will not come on board with this legislation, that they in fact reject the need for a ban. It's been set out so clearly, even by our own Senate committee, the inquiry into this. What we've heard from the government today will potentially cost lives. It sounds like it's just a matter of time if the government will not move on this, because there is overwhelming evidence that it is time that the ban was brought in. We've seen the evidence in such a dramatic form with the tragedy with the Grenfell Tower. We just escaped a similar tragedy at Docklands in Australia. And we know that there are so many buildings with this cladding on. Highly dangerous, highly inflammable, so many reports. So this is something that really does need to be taken on. But what we need to also identify what we're talking about here, it's not just about individual buildings, it's not just about the cladding on those buildings, it's why has it come to this point. It's come to this point because the building industry is effectively deregulated now, that these increasingly we're seeing these products come onto the market. They can often make a building look good, and that was part of the tragedy with the Grenfell Towers in London. It was a social housing complex in the middle of what had become a gentrified area, and many of the neighbours wanted the area to look good. So the quick way to achieve that was cladding. Unbeknown to the unfortunate people living in that building, they were living in a fire trap, and what a most terrible fire trap it was, as we saw so dramatically. And again, it's to emphasise the private market has been deregulated. Again, an example of the dangers of neoliberalism, what privatisation means when the regulation system is just left up to the private marketplace, which means it's not effective. Because how does the system work? It benefits the dodgy developers, the private market speculators, those who are looking to make money, because their job, while they're on this planet, is to increase their profits. How do you increase profits? By cutting corners in terms of labour, cutting corners in terms of the products that are used. So we have a very clear situation before us that the situation needs to change. But I did want to speak a little bit more about the British situation, because the evidence is so clear about the pressures that are on. So in some cases, what we see is that the developers are making the decisions themselves to go with this cheap form of cladding. But also in the case of Grenfell Tower, what we saw there is that the contractors themselves are under pressure to go with the cheapest option because of the severe cuts that have been made to social housing in Britain. And so the contractors are forced to cut corners when it comes to quality and safety. Now, the Grenfell Tower investigation found that the contractor had the option of installing the fire-resistant version of the cladding, but did not. The fire-resistant version cost just £2 per square metre more. Imagine that. Those 71 people would still be alive. Their families would be not suffering, still grieving. All the people injured would still be living a productive, happy, you would hope, healthy lives. But because of that terrible cost-cutting, how minimal is that? £2 per square metre more, and we could have had the safer cladding used. Social housing in Australia faces similar pressures, and despite record homelessness, rental insecurity and affordability, the government has not increased real spending on social housing. And this is where the pressure comes. When the government is building social housing, there is a real worry that we could have a similar situation to what we saw in Grenfell Tower. So again, let's be clear that the money also for social housing, for public housing across this whole country is there. What we should have moved, it shouldn't have happened in the first place, the benefits given to those who are so wealthy to have many homes to be able to increase their own wealth. But now we know that it's in robbing the public purse of badly needed money for public housing. $7.6 billion in capital gains tax discounts and about $4 billion in negative gearing benefits in 1 year. That's effectively what the government is giving away to those who already have housing benefits. Surely that's the money that should be put into our social and public housing across the country. And again, it is relevant to what we're talking about here, because so often what happens with this very dangerous cladding is that it's used on public and social housing with potentially tragic impacts. But we also know that it goes beyond those who are disadvantaged. This is a serious crisis that can affect all of us, our loved ones, depending on where they're living. And the evidence about this issue is now so clear. And I do refer you, when you're considering your position on this bill, is to look at the Economic Senate References Committee inquiry into the bill. The evidence was really overwhelming, very clear, and the recommendations and the findings from the report set out a case that very much backs up Senator Patrick's bill that is before us today. So it's the committee's report on aluminium composite panels that came down in September last year, and it recommended that the Australian government, these are the words from the committee, you couldn't have had it clearer, implement a total ban on the importation, sale and use of PE core ACPs as a matter of urgency. Now, that's referring, the PE core ACPs refers to the polyethylene core aluminium composite panels. So that's the terminology that we hear quite a bit in this. But again, total ban, very clear. And again, what we've just heard from the government, just ignoring the Senate report that sets out the case so strongly. The government therefore has rejected the need for an import ban because PE core ACPs can and are used in a way which does not breach the National Construction Code, in addition to being used in a non-compliant manner. Now, that's their argument. But again, it's a worthless argument. It's an argument that puts lives at risk. Also from the Senate committee, this was an additional finding. In light of the Grenfell Tower fire tragedy, the committee does not consider there to be any legitimate use of PE core ACPs on any building type. The committee believes that as there are safe, non-flammable and fire-retardant alternatives available, there is no place for PE core ACPs in the Australian market. Again, another emphatic statement from this inquiry. A reminder, what's going on with the government here? Why have they been so blatant in their rejection of this most important bill that we have before us, that has been a responsible action by Senator Patrick, responding firstly to the crisis that we have in the building industry, but responding to this most important inquiry? Why has the government gone to this length of protecting the dodgy developers, the property speculators? Because they're the people that they protect. That's where their interests lie, is working with corporate Australia so they can maximise their profits, even when it is actually risking lives. And we know that's real because lives have been lost in the tragedy that we have before us. Also, the CFMEU has come out very clearly with a position of support for the report, the recommendations from the inquiry. They've actually advised, this union, this construction union, have advised their members to refuse to install PE core ACPs on high-rise buildings. But interestingly, that advice, which again is about saving the lives of the public, of residents, of homeowners, of people staying in hotels. It's about saving lives. But what do we get from the government? Again, don't want to know about it. And we saw that very blatantly from the former minister, and that's worth sharing with you, because often there's some very ugly debates in this place about the work of the CFMEU. Here you have very clear evidence of this union taking a responsible position in support of what we now have heard from the recommendations from the inquiry, But where did the government stand? It wasn't just Senator Hume. She's clearly speaking from the government. But let's look back at what former Minister for Industrial Relations, Minister Cash, said, and the former head of the Australian Building and Construction Commission. They've said that they would state that refusal by workers to install would not be considered in illegal industrial action. So no backup there. No backup there. No backup there from the minister, from the commissioner of the ABCC for workers taking the responsible position of refusing to install this material. That would be the responsible position, where, yes, we might have our severe fights here about unions, etc., but what we're talking about here is about saving lives, about ensuring buildings don't get burnt down, putting more people at risk. Surely that's where we should have a common position. But no, the government always working with corporate Australia to put profits first, even when it comes to risking lives. And that's simply unacceptable, and it needs to be exposed at every turn. National Assistant Secretary Dave Noonan for the CFMEU has said, fire authorities, unions and even property developers support a ban on these combustible cladding products entering Australian ports, which is the most effective way of ensuring they don't end up in Australian homes and workplaces. So it's good to hear that some property developers are on side, working with the union, working with fire authorities on this. So there is this growing awareness, growing building of alliances. Meanwhile, we have the government just refusing to give national leadership on this most important question. And it needs a national response. Because as we've heard from Senator Carr earlier, the evidence again is well and truly out there that with the extensive privatisation that we've seen in the industry, particularly with regard to the Australian Buildings Code, where neoliberalism has ripped through it, so the weakness of that code makes it one that doesn't provide protection to residents, to builders, to the workers in this industry. It has become so worthless, and the job has become so much harder because of the imports of building materials. The development of building materials is going ahead in leaps and bounds. It's just changing the whole nature of building construction. You can see that in our cities, where the rate of development is just going ahead so fast, largely driven by the new products on the market. Not all those products are safe. It's going ahead so quickly. I acknowledge it's often hard for the authorities to keep up to speed with it, but something needs to be done. And that particularly means the issue with regard to imports. And that's why I again draw your attention to what Mr Noonan has said about the need to ensure that these products are not entering Australian ports. Because that's where we need to be giving added attention to, because once these products are into the country, they're often classified in incorrect ways. They end up on our building sites. I imagine some developers are not even sure what they're putting into their buildings. Workers have very little information, and certainly the residents, when they buy a new home, or if somebody's lucky enough to get a public housing place these days, have no idea is what their building has been constructed with and to what degree it is a fire hazard. So we're left with a system now where, with the government adopting the position it has, that thousands and thousands of lives are at risk in this country because this dangerous form of cladding is being used. It's being used as we speak in many of the buildings that are going up, buildings that we might live in, that we might stay in when we're working, let alone so many people, the rest of the population of Australia, being put at risk on a regular scale. So we need to have this bill needs to be passed, but what we need to commit to is a much more thorough regulatory system for building in this country. Yes, that is a state matter, but increasingly there is a role for the federal government. largely because of this importation issue, but also we need to get rid of the privatisation aspects that have crept into so much of how building is managed in this country. It's to the detriment of residents, it's a detriment to what even our neighbourhoods look like, it's to the detriment of workers. And now we know that lives are being put at risk. We need to change how we operate in this country and ensure that people's well-being is put first. And we've seen in a most blatant, crude way, with the way the government has rejected this bill, that that's not how the government judges important legislation that comes before this House, like the bill we're considering today.